In this video, I'll be talking about movement and input in p5.play. So the goal is to have a keyboard controlled sprite at the end of this. So we'll be talking about how to move a sprite, how to detect keyboard input, and then how to put those two things together to make it so that when you press the arrow keys, you can move a sprite around the screen. So the first step here is how to move a sprite. So let's create one. I'm going to create a variable to hold my sprite. I'll call it player sprite since that's what this is going to be, and I'll put this before setup so I can access that variable both in setup and in draw. I'm going to create player sprite, and I'm going to set it equal to new sprite, and I'll just give it a x and y position, pass it in at the center, which is half of 400, which is my canvas size for x and y, and then I'll give it a 50 diameter. Let's just run this to make sure it's working properly. It is. So how do we move this sprite? There are a number of ways. We'll go through three, two of which are pretty similar. The simplest thing to start with is just to say player sprite, and spell it, dot speed equals a value. So if I say 2 and we run this, you can see now it moves in the right direction. So why right? Well, by default, the other thing you can give it is you can pass the sprite is a direction. And by default, it has a direction of 0 degrees, which points to the right by default, if you remember from trigonometry. So player sprite dot direction represents an angle in degrees, starting with 0 being towards the right. So if we were to do this, this is essentially the same as the default, it just moves right. But what this allows us to do with this direction is now we can change this value. So if we were to say negative, and remember that it moves, if you start 0 right, it moves clockwise 9 degrees. That will point down. So if we put this 90, instead of going to the right, we've rotated 90 degrees clockwise, and now we're going down. And if we did 180, we should now be moving left since we've rotated from the right to the left, so 180 degrees. And to the top, we could go 270 or negative 90, if that's more easier to understand. So that's one way to move things. Another way is using vectors, which you've probably used before for setting positions, just kind of like two different values and a whole bunch of math that you can do around vectors as well. And the way that you can use vectors for speed, or in this case velocity, is using this parameter called VEL, which is short for velocity. So you can set the x velocity and the y velocity. If we just start with the x by doing vel.x, we can see it just moves in that same right direction because we're setting x to be a positive number. And remember, in the coordinate system, you start at the top left, so positive is to the right, and for the x, and down for the y. So if we were to give it a y velocity as well, then it will start moving down and to the right since y is positive is down. And if we wanted to make it move up, we could just change this to the y velocity to 0 and the x to, to negative 2 and the x to 0, and it will start going up. Another way to move a sprite. Now, both of these ways, you set it to a speed and a direction, it will just go that way until, forever, until you do something else. But you might want it to want a sprite to go to a particular position and then stop, for example, like an enemy that's patrolling in a game or something like that. And a way to do that is using the move to function. And to do that, you can pass in, you can pass in an x and a y and then a speed you want to go. So the x and y being the position you want to move that sprite to, and then the third parameter being the speed. So if we wanted to say go to 100, 100, which is a little bit up and to the left, with a speed of 2, it should then go to that position and then stop. Note that all of this you can find in the p5.play. If you go to p5.play, then learn, then sprite. If you go to the second page, I think, or 012, it shows you a bunch of ways to move things around. Also notice that you can just do sprite.x to change the x and y position as well. It's just another way to move sprite. Okay, so we've got the basics of movement down. Now how about input? If we want to detect keyboard input, and this stuff is also, has its own section here, so you can click through this. We'll start with keyboard input, and to do that we can use this KB object. And it's got a number of different functions that we can use to check to see if a button has been pressed, one of which is called presses. We'll talk about presses and pressing and the difference in this video. So if we just print out this KB presses function call, which will return a value either true or false if a button has been pressed. We also have to specify the button, so we can pass that in here, in quotation marks inside this presses function. If we put just kind of a value there, a character there, it should just work for that character. If I've now pressed the A key, it should print out a true when I press it down. So we can test this out by pressing play. I'll bring up the keyboard here so you can see it. One thing to note is that in order for the sketch, the p5.js sketch, to properly register keyboard input, you must click first on the sketch. That will get you. It'll get me later in this video, I'm sure. But so I've clicked here. You can see that it's just running and it's just printing out false because I haven't pressed A yet. But if I press A, you can see that it returns true. Only once, notice. So even if I hold down A, it still only returns true once. Now, if I say pressing, try to rerun this, and if I remember to click here to give this app focus or sketch focus, and then hold down A, now you see I return true 108 times while I'm holding it down because it's going 60 frames per second. Now, also note that if I were to, I'm going to clear this, so if I just press A once, just like really quickly, not once, just really quickly, oops, click the sketch, press it pretty quickly, even that quick tap was 8 frames. So definitely use the press is function if you want it to return, respond only once. So how do we use this? I mean, right now we're just printing something. We're not actually using this or responding or doing anything with code to respond to this input. What we can use is use an if statement if we want to actually respond with some code when this is true. And after that if statement, we can put the curly brackets, which will get, and everything within that will get executed when that A is being held down in this case. So I'm going to, just to visualize this a little bit better, I'll make my sprite a color of red. And when I'm holding down the A key, I will change it to green because I'm using pressing, which will respond to being held down. So this is now green. So when I press A, it should now, once I run this, click here. Now it will respond to input. If I hold down A, it will turn green. Now, this is different from, and actually it will stay green even when I let up. Why is that the case? Because I'm not doing anything else. I'm just setting it to green when this is true, when this is pressed, but I'm never ever setting it back. So if I want to kind of get a better view of how this functionality actually works, is I'll have an else statement that turns it back to red when pressing A is not true. And so now if I run this, I click here, hold down A, I let go. Then when I let go, else will be called and turn it back to red. And notice the difference between this and we do ES. So press is should only return once. Even if I hold this down, I get just a flash. So it's only executing this one time. Okay, so we've got the basics of input. Also note that this can be space if we want to return to the, if we want to respond to the space bar. Let's put this fast to ing so we can see that a little bit more clearly. We can also respond to the up arrow key by saying up. So there are some kind of special cases here as well. All right, so let's put this all together. We've got movement, we've got input. How do we make it so that we can use the arrow keys to move character around this, the sprite that we've got around the screen? So we've got up over here. Let's start there. Actually, let's just start from right since that's kind of the simplest. And remember, we can do this a number of different ways. There's lots of different ways to specifically to kind of write these if statements. But I'm going to just say, let's use the velocity method that we learned as opposed to speed and direction. So we can say vel.x, right? And give that a number, positive number. And if we try running this, clicking here, And now when I hold down this key, it should go. And actually, it just keeps on going. And why is that? It's kind of the same thing as before, right, with the colors. I'm not setting it back to 0 at any point. Once it's going, it's going. So how do I reset that? Well, I use an else statement, and I can say player sprite equals 0 down here. All right, so now if I run, click, I hold, now it's only going right when I press down right. So how to respond to how to go left? Well, same thing. We can kind of just copy and paste this code. I'm going to link this with an else if statement. So I'll just kind of paste this here, put an else in front here, and say left. And then the velocity, instead of going positive, will just be negative, right? So now if I run this, click here, left will go left, let go, stops, right will go right, let go, stops. All right, so we got a basic moving of the sprite here. The last thing I'll do is just one kind of gotcha that might happen is if we add up and down to this. Let's try it, see what happens. So again, I can just kind of copy this else if statement, and I'll paste it once and change it to up. And you can think, oh yeah, I just put up is negative y, so I can just change this to negative y, and then else if down is positive y, so if it just change this to y, that should all work, right? Well, if you try it out, you can see up and down works, and then left and right side working. It's still going up and down. Notice it's the same problem that we had before with the else statements, right? Essentially, once this is moving to the right, I set this to move to the right, right? The velocity of x to the right. If I press this right button. Once I'm holding down this button, and actually, it's harder to show on this keyboard because when it's often the case where you press down, you can press down both keys, which you can't really do with the mouse. But when you press down both keys, you can get this problem because you're holding down this right key and it's moving in the x direction, and it's continually moving in that x direction, regardless if you press down up or down. So you'll kind of get this this problem. And the easy way to fix this is you can just say, you know, actually the easiest way to do this is just to actually set this player X and player Y to be 0 in the beginning, so that every frame it resets to X and Y and then only sets the X to a positive when you're going left, only, or negative for going left, or positive going right, negative going left, and only the y for up and down. You could get the same thing if you just in each one of these if statements set the x and the y explicitly. So then said vel y equals 0 here, vel y equals 0 here, vel x equals 0 here, vel x equals 0 here. That's one way to do it, but an easier way is to do it once in the beginning, so that they're all kind of reset to 0 and only set to be positive in these different conditions. So now if we try this, and we use the up, down, left, and right, we will have kind of like what you'd expect this, how you'd expect this to move without any of those kind of those problems.